Okay, so welcome to Understanding Terrorism. This is the fifth edition, which should tell you that the book has been in print for a little while, and each edition makes the book. Every time they have a new edition, it means that the book is well received and well regarded. So we'll start off each chapter with a brief video from the author. His name is Gus Martin, and we'll talk about him a little bit later on. And so we'll get started. Okay, so we're going to go part one in the book is terrorism. It's a conceptual overview. It has terrorism's first impressions. It tries or attempts to define terrorism, and it looks at the beginnings of terrorism. So this book is generally, it's a survey and it's a history book, and it looks at terrorism since almost the beginning of time, although the early parts are brief. So chapter one is terrorism's first impressions.
Political violence is something that's not entirely understood by we observers because we assume that it is inherently wrong, inherently evil, that when the bombs are coming down on our head, clearly those people who are doing it are terrorists. However, one thing to keep in mind is there is such a thing in the world as oppression, and sometimes desperate people resort to desperate means. So the debate becomes, is political violence an acceptable expression by the oppressed? Now, clearly, the terrorists generally view themselves as championing the oppressed or that they are themselves oppressed. And they will say that even if they are terrorists, it's necessary, it's justifiable. Having said that, there is such a thing as true terrorism, and when innocents are the victims, when innocents are the targets, yes, that is evil in and of itself, and terrorism in that sense is inherently wrong. From the perspective of people in the Middle East, when the Western armies enter their territory, it is viewed as an invasion. And they would view the so called collateral damage that we always apologize for, the dead civilians, damaged infrastructure, they would view that as terroristic or at least very oppressive. And so, from their perspective, indeed, we are the invaders. When our weapons are used, for example, the drones, we have targeted specifically certain individuals. Those individuals are frequently at home with their families, so their families are killed too. And if you assume that our intelligence is good enough to know that they are at home, that is, the individual is at home, then we would have known that the families are there. And again, we view that as collateral.
So we'll start off with a couple of quotes. History is a construction of the contemporary mood and culture, and we learn from history that we learn nothing from history. The first one is from the historian Robert Dallek, and the second one is from George Bernard Shaw. So history is a construct, and it's written by each generation, and it's viewed by each generation through their own political context. We've heard about revisionist history. So each generation gets to write the history books, and they generally are written through the political prism and the cultural prism that's going on at that time. So you can read those and read those about those quotes. They're very interesting. I like them. The other thing is ethnocentrism, and it's having or based on the idea that your own group or culture is better or more important than others. Cultural relativism is the principle that an individual's human beliefs and activities should be understood by others in terms of that individual's own culture, and a value judgment, a personal opinion about how good or bad someone or something is. So these are important terms as we move forward in this class and look at terrorists, because one of the more famous quotes about terrorism is that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And so you're going to have to view and look at what we study here critically, and not be judgmental. Although it's very difficult not to be when we look at the terrorist actions, but we're here to try and understand not condone, but to understand why some of the acts are committed by the terrorist groups that we are going to study.
Today I want to talk about two very important concepts in cultural anthropology: ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. Ethnocentrism is the belief that one's own culture is superior to all others. It means viewing the rest of the world through the narrow lens of one's own cultural perspectives. Cultural relativism is the notion that any part of the culture, such as an idea, a thing, or a behavior pattern, must be viewed in its proper cultural context, rather than from the viewpoint of the observer's culture. And this is very important because as cultural anthropologists, we want to be able to understand a culture on its own terms and not through the lens of our own experience. So, if you look at this first image, you see a woman wearing what's called a hijab. And a hijab in Islam is the garment that women wear over their heads. There are variations on this. Niqab is the garment that covers also the woman's face. Now, if you see this, you may have certain preconceptions about what the hijab means. You may think that this woman is a victim of a male-dominated society, that she is a participant in a backwards-looking ideology. You may think that she's forced to wear the hijab, when it's more likely that this woman chooses to wear the hijab as a symbol of her devotion to God. And we have precedents for this. We understand that certain women, like in our culture, nuns for instance, wear a head covering to show their devotion to God. So this is understood and sort of seen as natural and correct in our culture, whereas some Westerners may see a Muslim woman wearing a hijab or niqab and see it as something that's backwards. So in some Arab countries, women wear head coverings or even face coverings to show their devotion to God. They choose to do so, right, without coercion. And you may see them, in fact, alongside women wearing bikinis, such as the scene from Alexandria, Egypt. It should be said that in some Arab or Muslim countries, women are forced to wear the hijab. In Afghanistan, in Iran, and in Saudi Arabia, women are forced to cover to some degree. Now, by the same token, a Muslim woman, say from Afghanistan, may see this image of Miley Cyrus and wonder why she's wearing her underwear on television. Right? She may have no proper cultural context to place this in, right? She may not know that the Video Music Awards are a place to push boundaries with regards to clothing and sexuality, or a place to be edgy. You know, a woman in Afghanistan may have no concept of what edgy means. Okay. Again, we have plenty of examples of women covering their hair in our own societies to show their devotion to God. Amish and Mennonite women, for example, will cover their hair. Here's another image of a woman doing something that you don't ordinarily think women who wear the hijab do. This woman is a sniper in the Syrian town of Aleppo. She's one of these Syrian rebels that you hear about on television. Now, you can also take these ideas, ethnocentrism and cultural relativism, and apply it to food. We may think that our culture's notions about what is appropriate food are sort of normal and correct, but if you really look at them, they actually become sort of strange, right? So we see eating chicken nuggets and chicken sandwiches as something that's sort of normal and natural and correct, but if you really dig down deep into the way our food is produced, you find that it's actually kind of strange. Modern chickens are produced in, they reach a full size in 47 days. Their meal, the food that they're fed often contains things like caffeine and estrogen mimickers or hormones and so on. And it's actually very strange if you look at it from sort of a detached perspective. Back to the veil again. Many of the women in the class will eventually wear a veil on their wedding day, and we see that as something normal and natural and appropriate and right, because we have sort of a context for it. We have a frame for it. back to food. So you may think, for example, that eating sushi, eating raw fish is something that's strange, and you would never think about doing it. Think it's gross because you're sort of ethnocentric when it comes to raw fish, and that's okay. But you should know that for the Japanese, it's perfectly normal and natural and right, and for an increasing number of Americans to eat things like raw fish, right? So it's also, well, I'll give you another example with regard to food and then we'll be done. In some parts of the world today, in China, Korea, and Vietnam, it is still the case that people will eat dog meat, for instance. Now, this seems to us, well, to many of us, you would see this as disgusting, absurd, because dogs are seen as domestic animals, well, not even domestic animals, they're seen as companion animals, right? They're seen as our friends or members of our families and not food. But there's nothing sort of intrinsic about a dog that makes it a companion animal or a pet rather than a food source. Now, I'm going to show you two images. One of these is dog meat and the other is beef. Can you tell the difference? Can you tell which is which? Actually, this one is dog, and this one is beef. Now, had I told you it was the opposite, right? You probably would have had sort of a, repulsion. You would have felt repulsion. You would have felt disgusted at one or the other had I tricked you and tried to show you the beef and told you it was dog. And that's what culture does to us. Culture can make us feel that way. Ethnocentrism can make us feel that way. We can look at other people's cultures, practices, ideas, and feel repulsed by it, even though it's sort of arbitrary. It's just because the way we were raised, we don't see dogs as food. We see them as pets. Okay. Now, it should be said that cultural relativism does not necessarily imply moral relativism, right? These are two different things. Just because you want to understand culture on its own terms doesn't mean that you have to accept that culture as morally correct, right? You don't have to accept that particular cultural practice as morally correct. You can still go on and see eating dog is sort of morally wrong, or eating all animals is morally wrong. That's up to you. But if you're going to be an anthropologist, you need to apply cultural relativism, which means understanding a culture practice on its own terms, not necessarily putting your moral compunctions on that practice, being able to step outside of your own view of the world, your own lens on the world, to step outside of your own biases and see why people may do things in the way that they do them. Okay, so that's the idea. One of the ideas in anthropology is that we want to make the strange familiar and the familiar strange, and that's one of the things that I'm trying to do in this course, right? So to some of you, this looks strange, but this is familiar, but they're both sort of the same thing, and hopefully I've gotten you to see that. Okay.
Okay, so that was a quick video explaining ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. So as we study terrorism, we'll see that it's studied by many, many different fields, including sociologists, criminologists, political scientists, and psychologists. They all study terrorism. And Margaret Crenshaw, she's a well-written academic who has studied it for years. She says that terrorism research takes place in a mixed and messy world of academics, think tanks, government analysis, journalists, and pundits. And she's right. And prior to September 11th, there were not very many people that were experts on terrorism. Bruce Hoffman was one, Margaret Crenshaw was another. But since September 11th, terrorism and the study of terrorism has become an extremely popular field of endeavor. So sociologists, that's the study of science, social institutions, social relationships, specifically the systematic study of development, structure, interaction, and collective behavior of organized groups of human beings. So obviously, terrorist groups will fall into that um, category. So sociologists would be very interested in studying the different groups. Criminology is the study of crime, criminals, and punishment. And obviously, if we study terrorists and view them as criminals or their acts as criminals, and of course we're going to talk about this a little bit later on, then criminologists will be interested in the study. And political science is the study of description and analysis of political and especially governmental institutions and processes. So obviously, a group like ISIS is a political movement as well as a religious movement. So political scientists are interested because inevitably most terrorist groups, although they might be religious or they might be secular or non-secular, sectarian, whatever the group is claiming, ultimately most groups are looking for political action. They want to take over or they want to be heard. Psychology is a study of the mind and behavior and the way a person or a group thinks. So when we study groups of terrorists, psychologists are interested. Lately, psychologists have become more interested in the study of the lone wolf terrorist, the person that becomes a terrorist without being a member of a group. And so that's an interesting study that's just fairly new, and psychologists are very interested in that field of study. So why do we study terrorism and terrorists from a historical perspective? Well, people just don't wake up in the morning and decide that they're going to become terrorists. There are usually reasons for their grievances, be it political or religious oppression, um, unfair taxation. There's a whole myriad of reasons why people become terrorists or why people become extremists and are eventually led down a terrorist path. Um, James R. Grossman, in September 1st, 2014, New York Times wrote, "People don't kill one another just for recreation. They have reasons, and those reasons are usually historical." And I think that quote hits the nail on the head, um, and it explains to a degree why we do study it. We learn from history, and hopefully we learn from history our mistakes. As one of my earlier quotes says, we learn from history that we learn nothing from history. And as students in emergency management, we know that sometimes if we're not vigilant, we don't learn from history and we make the same mistakes. And that's why we're here to study emergency management so that in the future we don't make those mistakes, the same mistakes. So, in order to avoid the mistakes of the past, um, we study different groups and we study um, terrorist organizations to see how they operate and to try and learn from them. So here we study from two different perspectives, the practitioner or the educator student, and some of us are both. Some of us are practitioners here. They're persons who regularly does an activity that requires skill or practice. Some of our students are in the military or just out of the military. Some of our students um, are in the emergency management field as first responders. So they're studying here as practitioners and as students. So as students or educators, we must think critically about the world and the issues we face. So we have to look at some of these different groups and different organizations critically and try and learn as much about them as we can. So critical thinking is, in short, self-directed, self-disciplined, self-monitored, and self-corrective thinking. There's a long definition above this, which you can read on your own. But as students, we might be asked in this class to compare and contrast groups or events. So to compare something is to look at two or more things closely in order to see what's similar about them. And to contrast is to compare two things to show how they are different. So if I ask you in the future to write an essay and compare and contrast two different groups, this is what I want you to do. This is what I'm looking for. Okay, so there's 5 basic principles of critical thinking. Few truths transcend the need for empirical testing. So while religious beliefs and personal values may be held as matters of faith, most other ideas can be evaluated by applying the rules of logic or evidence and the scientific method. Critical thinkers wonder what it would take to show that a truth is false. So you're questioning a truth. Critical thinkers do not always know what is true. Instead, they question their beliefs and are willing to admit they are wrong. So, it's questioning things, and not taking it at face value. Authority does not automatically make an idea true. Just because a teacher, guru, or celebrity or authority is convinced or sincere doesn't mean you should automatically believe that person. It is unscientific and self-demeaning to just take the word of an expert without asking, is there a better explanation? What evidence convinced you or him of that idea? And also, judging the quality of evidence is crucial. Imagine that you're a juror in a courtroom judging claims, by two lawyers, opposing lawyers. To decide correctly, you can and just weigh the amount of evidence. You can't just weigh the amount of evidence. I'm sorry. You must, critically evaluate the quality of the evidence, and then you give greater weight to what's more credible. And in juries today, the quality of the evidence could be DNA testing, as opposed to an eyewitness account. We found that eyewitness accounts are often not as accurate as, say, DNA evidence. So critical thinking, finally, requires an open mind. And in this course, you need to have an open mind to understand how and on what and how and in what circumstances terrorism possibly occurs. So be prepared to consider daring departures or go wherever the evidence leads. In the case of different terrorist groups, again, we're trying to understand, not condone. However, you shouldn't become so open-minded that you are gullible, simply gullible because you don't want to believe all opposing ideas, because on every side there's two different opposing opinions. So you don't want to be so gullible that you believe the one or believe one over the other, and not base it on the aforementioned 4 things before coming to that conclusion. So it's important that we become critical thinkers as we read on in Martin's text.